I'm Kate Shafson. I'm the Associate Dean of the Law School, and thank you so much for having me. I am here to introduce the last speaker of the day, and that is Professor Talid El-Sabawi, and she holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and is currently pursuing her Ph.D. in public health at The Ohio State University. She's also an attorney who has been offering pro bono representation to children in foster care who've been removed from homes where parents are drug addicts. She's the author of 5 articles and books focusing on addiction and the opioid crisis. And today she's going to share empirical data on the rhetoric pressure groups have historically used to develop American drug policy. She will explain how practitioners and advocates can leverage these narratives to better frame issues surrounding the opioid epidemic to produce more effective legislative outcomes. So please join me in welcoming Professor Sabawi.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, so disclaimer, I'm still considered a teaching assistant, even though I teach my own courses. Not there yet. Almost, though, in the fall. Fingers crossed. So I get the pleasure and the honor of being in front of you today and standing between you and the door. So I'll try to make it as interesting as possible. By way of introduction, that was a fabulous introduction. I've always told my students when I teach, however, that it's very important to know the epistemological background of the person that's speaking in front of you. What does that mean? Well, what is the person's theory of knowledge seeking? I am a constructivist. And my intellectual lineage, which means that my dissertation advisor and her advisor before her and her advisor, we all imprint on each other. It's like having parents. So they influence how we think. So that's how I do my research. That's the lens with which I look at the world. And I think that's important to know. There's 3 tenets that she really raised me under, right? The first one was, if everybody believes it, it probably is not true. So, in research, if everybody believes something, it probably isn't true. We're going to find out in 5 years, okay? The next tenet was, don't tell me how you want to change policy if you don't know how we got here in the first place. All right, so anytime somebody would come to our class and say, I want to change this about policy, your response would be like, great, so how did we get here? Lastly, you can't change policy unless you understand how policy making works. So we have we heard some great solutions that would make great legislative solutions today. But without an understanding of the policy-making process, and without an understanding specifically of what's called the problem definition process, we're going to be unable to effectuate such change. So that's what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about. I'm going to breeze through some slides. So in order to strategically affect change, we need an understanding of what's called the problem definition process and the roles that groups play in the process. We can all effectuate change in the political process if we join groups and have a shared narrative. And I'm going to demonstrate to you throughout drug policy history how it has been done before successfully and how some have failed to do it. So the purpose of this presentation is to give you a better understanding of the legislative problem definition process. So I'm focusing on the legislature here. This process happens in administrative agencies throughout the government, but I'm talking specifically about the legislative process here and the role that both administrative agencies and organized interest groups, which I collectively call pressure groups because they put pressure on the legislature. So yes, you can cite me, nobody else uses that term. They put pressure on the legislature to have certain legislative solutions. So in order for us to get there, we're going to need to understand a little bit about this thing called problem definition and this thing called narrative theory, and it comes out of policy studies. Then we're going to go through and analyze key points in drug policy history and identify strategies that were used by these groups and how it shaped legislative discourse and it pressured Congress to support certain policy solutions. You'll notice this recurring theme that at times we attributed the cause of addiction or overdoses to disease, and at times we attributed it to deviancy. So those are common themes. You'll also hear me say, doesn't this sound familiar a lot? And we've already tried it, look, it doesn't work, all right? So we have a tendency in drug policy to have amnesia, okay? We forget that we've already done this before, and we already tried all of these solutions, but very few of us remember them. Okay, so problem definition and the narrative process. So problem definition is the process in the political sphere where actors define a social problem. So there is a struggle between actors who have their different perceptions about what reality is, what caused the problem, what is the solution. We come together as a society and we have this discourse, okay? And it's been called by Rochford and Cobb as a struggle over alternative realities. That's what is at the heart of politics and policy making, the struggle over alternative realities. So each of these realities is contestable, it's debatable, and problems are defined in the political sphere based on these perceptions. So what is a policy narrative then? So policy narrative is a tool. It's a rhetorical tool that we use in the policy process to communicate to one another our structure and our understanding of the world, right? It's a story, and it resembles a fictional narrative. It has characters, it has plot lines, it has endings, it has story arcs, but it has a higher standard of believability or credibility than a fictional narrative, right? It needs to, in order to be found credible by society, it needs to be supported by some type of expert, right? We want to know who's telling us this narrative, and do I believe them? Do they have the expertise required to make this a credible story? Also, to make it credible, a narrative can cite to scientific evidence or any empirical evidence that makes the story more believable. More credible. Let's get these mixed up. Believability has to do with how much the narrative resonates with what we already hold true about the world. So if we're describing an addict, and an addict, the way we describe him resonates with the way that we have experienced addicts in our lives, that character is more believable to us. So if we see a bunch of addicts that are homeless and begging on the streets, and that's how they're portrayed, then that narrative is believable to us, right? Because it resonates with the way we perceive reality. So these are kind of the two elements. Another way that believability is built on is the familiarity of the plot line. We like to recycle plot lines in policy. So we use the same plot line for different problems. We also, already talked about that, sorry. Lastly, I skipped the order, I'm sorry. The cultural and societal norms and how much that resonates with the story, okay? So if we're talking to an audience where their cultural and societal norms don't mesh with the narrative that we're telling, they're not going to believe the narrative that we're telling about reality. This will make more sense when we look at examples. It's one of those things where it's extremely theoretical. All right, what's a causal story? It's a type of narrative. It's a type of narrative that describes the cause of a problem. And that causal story often involves action or inaction by one of our characters, okay? So it's the addict's fault because the addict can't stop his bad behavior, all right? That's a causal story. And then it sets up the solution. So by assigning blame and benefits in the story, we set up the solution. So if we say it's the addict's fault for his addiction because he can't refrain from hedonistic behavior, what is the solution? To punish the bad behavior, to get him to stop doing the bad behavior, right? Incarceration. If we say addiction is a disease, how do we treat diseases? We send him to the health system, right? Okay, so policy narratives, there's all these causes to a problem. We take them, we focus them in on a few causes, and we align them with the solution that we want. And that's how policymaking works. That's the reality of policy. All right, so when designing these narratives, groups can go about it in different ways. They can design a narrative to further a solution. So they start off with the solution, and then they design the rest of their narrative around that solution. They could do it to avoid a solution. They can do it because they really have a causal theory they want to put forward. So the example I use with this is maybe we just want to put forth the addiction as a disease narrative because it in and of itself has utility. It destigmatizes addiction. It might not give us the best policy results because it doesn't look at the societal determinants of health, like the social determinants of health for those of you that do public health, but at the same time it destigmatizes it. So maybe we want to push that causal narrative for that purpose. We can also design a narrative with the target population in mind. We picked, so what's a target population, another word? It's just the population that the policy targets. We just like to make up words that sound fancy. That's all it is. Okay. So, and I'm going to give you examples of all this. All right. So, I think we can all accept that history is important. And this quote by David Musto, who is, if you write anything in drug policy and you haven't read David Musto's work, you really, really should. He is one of the most renowned historians in drug policy. But this was his comment in regards to the crack cocaine epidemic, okay, in the 1980s. And what's funny about the quote is it resonates so much with the current epidemic, right? If we don't know our history of drug abuse, if we're going to make wise decisions now and in the future, then how can we do it without these guideposts? Okay, and he said that in the 80s, and here we are again. So I'm going to now put you in my time machine, and we're going to go back in time. It's going to be a long journey. We have about 150 years to cover in about 19 minutes and 43 seconds. So I am taking you back in time to the 1800s, and we are going to talk about the nation's first opioid epidemic. When I start talking about the nation's first opioid epidemic, I often get looks of confusion. Life was different back then. They didn't have electricity in the house. Congress is completely different. Politics. What similarities could possibly exist from an opiate epidemic in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and in 2018, right? Well, one thing that's very important, one important similarity is that there was a subpopulation of iatrogenic addicts. That, by the way, is the term. We've talked about them a lot today. That is the term of people who become addicted because the doctor prescribed them a medication and the properties of that medication. So it's by medical error they became addicted. So there's actually a term for that. They're called iatrogenic addicts. Or they used to be called that. I don't know now because I guess the term died. So most of this population were demographically similar to the population that currently we have in the opioid epidemic. They were middle to upper class whites. They were mostly women, so the lore that Civil War veterans were the first opioid epidemics. Go look, Courtwright has written 2 books on why that is lore. That is not really true. Most likely doctors did not create our first, there's very convincing arguments. He did a lot of historical work. I'm not going to rehash it right now. It was mostly Southern women, housewives, mothers who people could afford to go to a doctor, who had a continuous supply of morphine, okay? And they were our First Nations addicts, true. So who was blamed? Another similarity. Physicians, pharmacists, and drug manufacturers were blamed, right? For drug manufacturers, again, back in the early 1800s, told doctors that morphine wasn't addictive, okay? Arguably, they had a prescription drug monitoring program in 1914. They did. We had one. No, we really did. Law enforcement used it to track down the doctors that were over-prescribing opiates. That didn't work. Here we are, right? So legislators also defined iatrogenic addiction as a disease back in the early 1800s. And interestingly enough, my current work is drug manufacturers and pharmacists and physicians were all active in the lobbying process back then like they are right now. That's not a common feature in drug policy, by the way. They're usually not active in drug policy. All right, so we're setting the scene. We have these 4 interest groups that were really active. They're currently active. You might see you up there. And they had different reasons for being active. Most of it was financial incentive. Physicians were, medicine was in its infancy. They didn't really have great tools at that point that were effective. Morphine was effective. And if you could deliver some effective relief for your patients, you wanted to hold on to it, right? Pharmacists were going through a battle with physicians at this time over who should be the one that should be able to prescribe. They prescribed opiates. They also made their own medication and elixirs and sold them. Some of them did. They were also there was a great division in pharmacy, and some were just retail pharmacists who sold the over-the-counter medications, which were called patent medicine. We all familiar with patent medicine. It contained cocaine often and opiates as their number one ingredient. At this time, they did not have to tell people what was in the medicine, so they were actively lobbying. Okay, and then we had self-proclaimed ethical drug companies, which are the drug companies we now know. All right, so their goal was to keep opiates and cocaine accessible for medicinal use. That was where they started with their narrative. Their strategy was to start with the policy solution. So their considerations, well, they had to account for public sentiment. Remember, I told you cultural norms and so forth, kind of important. So they knew that there was a growing knowledge that these substances are probably addictive, right? And there was also a fear at this time of marginalized populations. So we had Chinese immigrants coming in. There was fear of Chinese immigrants, and there was fear of blacks, okay? Especially in the South. So they had to account for non-iatrogenic drug use, which means drug use that was not started by a physician, essentially. So they came up with 2 narratives. The first narrative was that if you're middle or upper class whites or white women, these are what they called desired patients. Like, they had money and they wanted to continue to have as their patients. The drugs that you used were likely opiates. So the cause of your addiction was that addiction is a side effect. It is a side effect, just like any other side effects, and therefore the doctor should be the one who decides if it's a worthy side effect, and if you get addicted, the doctor should be the one who treats you because they handle your side effects. All right? So the American Medical Association and the American Pharmacists Association all got behind this narrative. However, this other target population, Chinese immigrants and blacks, they used mainly smoking opium, cocaine, some opiates. But the reason that they were addicted was because they had weak moral character, or they really liked to engage in these hedonistic behaviors, all right? So the legislative consequences were, and the consequences, why everybody was afraid is that, yes, these were the real narratives. So black men became physically stronger when they took cocaine. An increased sexual proclivity, which, by the way, there's no research for any of this, and an increased criminal behavior, which, come talk to me afterwards. The legislative solution was imprisonment. So the first drug to be outlawed in the U.S. was actually smoking opium. Okay? Why? Because, well, marginalized populations used it. There was no group there to lobby to protect it, and there was a lot of fear. So this is the American Pharmacists Association, and I quoted them, right? So they said, actually, drug fiends or the demi-monde, known criminals, or those whose occupations are shady, yes, they use shady, should be totally prohibited, okay? I use a lot of direct quotes because people don't believe me when I say. However, it was a believable narrative, and it was credible because these narrators used their expertise as doctors and pharmacists and as the medical industry in order to support their narrative. And it ended up becoming legislation. The American Pharmacists Association drafted the model law at the time. The 1914 Harrison Tax Act was literally negotiated by the National Drug Trade Conference, which was a coalition of these groups, to make sure that the Harrison Tax Act, at least on its face, looked like it was not preventing these prescribers from accessing the medicine, okay? But so the Harrison Tax Act was a prescription monitoring program of the day. They didn't have computers, but doctors had to say when they prescribed or sold the medication, and the Bureau of Internal Revenue was the one who was in charge of enforcing it. So now we have administrative agencies in the federal government coming in. We're around World War II. We're getting back in our time machine. Here we go. We have the Bureau of Internal Revenue involved in drug policy. What? That's kind of weird. They do a study. The Bureau of Internal Medicine, they needed some funding, right? They believed wholeheartedly that it was their duty to enforce the underlying morals of the law, not just the letter of the law, and the Supreme Court ended up upholding most of their actions. But they manufactured a report that said that there were 1 million addicts in the United States at the time. Now, this was after World War I. People were afraid of the other, and then you're saying there's 1 million addicts hiding in the corner that are about to all come out on us? It was pretty scary and effective. So Congress gave the BIR money in order to ramp up their efforts to handle these 1 million addicts and their doctors. So they persecuted physicians. They arrested 25,000 of them. All right, that's a lot of people back then. All right, let me just point that out. And then, of course, later BIR comes out and says, by the way, we may have overestimated the million. Our data collection may not have been accurate. Okay, this caused the AMA and the APHA to retreat. They were like, all right, we're getting arrested. Let's forget this whole disease narrative, right? There was also decreased need for opiates. The demographics of the addict population changed. We now have young city dweller men who were doing it that were already associated with the criminal underworld. So we already have a complete change in demographics. We don't really care about that population, right? We don't need to lobby for them. So there was also physician education, self-regulation, and the AMA was evolving. We could talk about the AMA at another time as an interest group. So they changed their narrative. Their narrative was, addiction is a psychiatric disorder caused by repressed psychological issues. Oh, and for my public health people, the Public Health Service, which is the predecessor to Health and Human Services, joined in on this narrative and added that drug use is caused by a personality disorder called psychopathy. And psychopathy also causes crime and antisocial behaviors. So yes, at this time, we literally thought addicts were psychopaths. There is no cure for psychopathy. And so somebody before was talking about involuntary commitment. Yeah, we already did that. They were called addict farms. They would involuntarily commit people to these treatment centers, and they didn't work, right? They did not work. Okay, so enter Harry Anslinger. Who has heard of Anslinger? Anybody in this room? Like, two people in the back. Hey! Yeah, okay, so the father of the war on drugs, most people think it's Nixon. And he is the first president to declare war on drugs. It's actually Anslinger. Okay, Anslinger was the head of the Narcotics Bureau, which came around in 1930. And the Narcotics Bureau developed in the Internal Revenue Service, and then it went to the DEA. They're the predecessor to the DEA. The interesting thing about the Narcotics Bureau, when Anslinger was put as head of it, he came from the Prohibition Bureau. Do we know anything about the Prohibition Bureau? Were they very successful? No. So his agenda, his goal, his entire 32 years as head of this agency, 32 years, was do not become like the Prohibition Bureau, okay? We have to make sure we stay relevant. We have to make sure that we get funded. And boy, was he good at it, okay? Congress and the administration saw him as the leading expert on drug policy and drugs because he was a master storyteller. So he was really good at creating fear, right? And there have been dissertations written about his rhetoric. It is that good. From people who don't study drug policy, so they weren't interested in it because of the drug policy, just because he's great. So what were his narratives? I have some of them because, again, people don't believe me. The addict, he claimed, is like a typhoid carrier. He will spread crime and disease wherever he goes. He will spread addiction. He testified stories like this in front of Congress to support solutions. So regarding medication-assisted treatment, he said, the idea of the government poisoning its citizens with narcotics is nonsense. Why don't they set up barrooms for alcoholics? Why not furnish everybody with what they want, bullets or department stores for kleptomaniacs and so on? That was the nation's leading expert. And he declared a war on drugs far before Nixon did, who surprisingly actually expanded treatment, but just talked a big game about declaring a war. We could talk about that too. I could send you some books. That's not the talk today, though. Again, I live and breathe drug policy history, so if anything, at least this talk has given you little tidbits to bring up at dinner conversation, like, did you know? All right, so the solutions that came into play when Anslinger was in charge was stiff mandatory sentencing for possession and drug use, Oh, remember that death sentence thing for trafficking? Yeah, we already did that. Okay, 1956. The death penalty was permitted for sale of drugs to a drug minor. Did that work? No. Here we are. All I have to say is here we are again. But again, he was so effective with the narratives. The ABA-AMA finally stepped up and said, okay, this is kind of messed up. We're killing, we're basically taking people, giving them the death sentence for selling possession. This is an issue. Maybe we need to try to step back in and redefine addiction here as a health issue. So they tried to testify in front of congressional hearings. They formed this joint commission. They wanted to put out a report because they thought the problem was that there wasn't enough research. So there needed to be more research to prove their story. So they spent all this time, they did this very well-researched report in 1958, and they made the mistake of underestimating their opponent. They took that interim report and they sent it over to HJA. And as Rufus King wrote, one of the authors of the report, said the ABA-AMA was no match for HJA because the ABA made them and AMA made the mistake of printing only a couple of those reports. They didn't want it to, us lawyers, doctors, really careful. We want to make sure it's right before all those blue book footnotes are right before it goes to publication, so they didn't publish. So what did Aslinger do? He hit the media and he went on the offensive. Even before anybody saw the report, they had already published their comments. They widely disseminated it, and they called it a joke, right? So by the time the ABA's final report came out in 1961, everybody had already discounted their arguments. They had no chance. They made the mistake of believing that evidence was going to battle a narrative. You can't take evidence to a battle of narratives. It doesn't work, right? The narrative will always win out. If it's a better narrative, even if yours has more data, you got to tell a good story. All right, so I only have, it says I have 7 minutes on my clock, so I don't know. No, I'm just kidding. How many minutes? Yeah. Okay, got 4. All right, we're going to quickly go through the 1970s and 1980s. Not bad, right? The political climate was interesting here. We had NORML, which is it's an organization that lobbies for marijuana legalization. We had a parents group that started, it was grassroots, and they were very concerned. Some of you may remember this, right? Their goal was to shift government focus from hardcore drugs to teen users of marijuana. So their narratives was literally their narratives, I'm not making this up, it's actually in a NIDA publication. Stop focusing on the black crack problem, right? We want you instead to look at our kids. They refer to these druggies who are peer pressuring our teenagers to use drugs and in some cases also supplying them. So the problem was they didn't really have any evidence because at the time there was no scientific evidence that showed that marijuana was detrimental at the time. And there were treatment providers that were testifying in front of Congress like, hey, we have a crack cocaine problem we should probably pay attention to. So what did they do? Well, they went over to NIDA and they found Director Robert DuPont at that point, and they asked him, can you help us find the evidence? And so he said, you know what, I didn't realize this was a problem. I'm going to commission you, Marcia Schuchard, English teacher, to write these 2 articles for NIDA, where she stated that marijuana was a gateway drug. That is where that came from, by the way. Not because there was any evidence. It's a NIDA publication, but an English teacher wrote it, okay? So they also administered their own surveys. It's very fascinating time. And just quickly, one quote, my time is almost up. They said, look, you want to talk about credentials? Well, I'm a mother. That's the most important credential that I could have. I don't care what these signs they took on. And they were relentless. These parents would call thousands of phone calls a day. They scared NIDA directors. It was an interesting time. So anyway, they were successful in the sense that, according to policy scholar Michael Massing, by the end of the congressional hearing that quote came from, the possibility of marijuana decriminalization had died, and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which you should be familiar with, which created a lot of the penalties that we have today, was the embodiment of these parents' model of drug abuse. They were completely a grassroots organization that had a narrative, found evidence or created it, and then convince somebody powerful in the executive department to listen to them. All right, so if I haven't convinced you of the power of narratives yet, or at least taught you something sort of interesting about drug policy history, I have more. I forgot to tell you about the antibody theory of addiction. Have you guys heard of this? This was our leading medical theory in the early 1900s for addiction. It was that we had antibodies in our blood that caused people to not be able to refrain from drinking or using drugs. That was the leading theory in the 1900s. I'm not lying. Look it up. Antibody theory. Okay. So summary is, what is our lesson learned, our concluding remarks? In the academy, we focus on the research and on numbers. We want the evidence to be there, and numbers have their place. But numbers are important more so in the number of people who tell the same narrative. Okay, so if we really want to change policy, we can't do it with evidence alone. And here are some things concerned citizens can do. Identify the solutions that are probably evidence-based, then strategically craft a compelling narrative that aligns with your desire. I put public health because that's where I come from. So, but it has to account for cultural norms and beliefs, and then form coalitions that share that narrative. Take a page from the book of the English teachers and mothers in the 80s who, changed drug policy, the courts of drug policy history, and form coalitions and use those narratives to persuade high-ranking government officials that there needs to be a policy change and that the solution that you choose is the solution that should be adopted. So, above all, remember, it's not the evidence, but the problem redefinition and its accompanying narratives that drive policy change. And that is my time.